Well, National MP and spokesperson for conservation Jackie Dean spoke to Farmers Weekly journalist Annette Scott in last week's Farmers Weekly about her view that the Crown Pastoral Land Reform Bill clearly aims to put an end to farming in the high country. And one of the 2,000 submissions before the Environment Select Committee will be from the regional council that has a large majority of leasehold high country properties within its boundaries, Environment Canterbury, who have been one of the most proactive councils with the introduction of farm environment plans well before national regulation. So how do you balance the shared environmental outcomes of our catchments from the mountains to the sea under different land management? To explain more to us is Environment Councillor and farmer Ian Mackenzie, who's also had various roles with federated farmers at regional and national levels and joins us now. Ian, could you please paint the picture for us who don't understand and have a background around the Crown Pastoral Land Reform, the tenure review, and how it differs of Environment Canterbury's role and Land Information's role?
I'm not sure I'll be very good at doing that, Sarah, but because it seems to be a double up. What this Act is proposing is a double up between LIN's responsibility and the Regional Council's responsibility. We have responsibility to all land management to ensure that water quality and land degradation doesn't occur. And so we have overarching jurisdiction, I guess you could say, in terms of what should or shouldn't be done on the land, and that tends to be incorporated into our sub-regional and regional plans. Of course, that role has been usurped by central government in terms of the essential freshwater package, which then sets another layer on top of all the plans we already have in place. And as far as I can see, this Act is putting another layer on top for regulatory control by LINs as opposed to the Regional Council, to which high country leaseholders will have to comply. And I can understand a degree of nervousness from leaseholders what this might look like in the future. But it's probably a bit too early to say just how LINs and the Regional Council will settle into working either with each other or just creating multiple layers that will be imposed upon the leaseholders.
The reason I ask that is, the reason I ask that is I'm trying to get my head around Philip Todd Hunter, the chair of the High Country Accord, who couldn't be with us sadly on this program, but has written a large piece, is around some of the things with the requiring a consent to carry out fencing work, to fencing off waterways, and then of course replacing that with a stock water system, and a long list of conditions to meet. It seems what I'm trying to clear up is that the farming activity change and land use change, is this more than what will be required of each and every farmer across New Zealand? And if so, how?
I think in the face of it, it probably is no more than every other farmer has to face, and that you'll know that all farmers are effectively being told what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, this concept of license to operate. I think what is different is, well, what is unclear is at this stage is just who will have that jurisdiction, how many layers of jurisdiction Philip and his fellow high country leaseholders will have to face to get those consents. Because if you have to have them, if LINs have any variation in their requirements for consent in the Regional Council and the essential freshwater operating the essential freshwater package, then there might be multiple layers of consenting required. If LINs, the Regional Council and central government work and have one a combined set of rules which applies, which is the same as pretty much makes the rules the same as everybody else, then the high country guys will be no better or worse off than those of us who farm in other parts of New Zealand.
Ian, I understand yourself and other councillors have been on multiple high country properties, in not only in your role but also with Federated Farmers, and you've seen firsthand the conservation work that leaseholders do within the high country, but you may also have other concerns around what they could be doing better. From your personal opinion, what are you seeing out there, and what direction would you like to see around the high country's future?
Well, my personal opinion is that ever since Helen Clark got intervened in tenure review and made it compulsory, the high country run holders have been on a short path to problems, and that's because they had a system which, as you say, which resulted in very high level of stewardship through the lease process. Intergenerational, effectively as close to freehold as you get without actually being freehold. There were limits on what they could do, but that was agreed between Linds and the leaseholders. And the net result was actually a very high level of stewardship by high country run holders to the land that they had control over. Helen Clark intervened politically, and I think it's created an expectation from the public that they have a say in everything that goes on land, which is not always positive, and B, it created quite a lot of unintended consequences. And so some of those unintended consequences are that those run holders who quite legitimately went through tenure review got criticised for taking advantage of perhaps some so-called preferential treatment, and they did it for all the right reasons, and they were in fact had to do it because it was a compulsory process, as I understand it, pretty much a compulsory process. But what has happened is that there has been some considerable intensification in some areas in the high country, on that leasehold country where that's become freehold. To balance the fact that a lot of those guys had to give up their summer or extensive grazing opportunity to take the ecological pressure off their stations. Where that's happened, of course, the regional council gets involved, because if you've got small, shallow, and now slightly warmer lakes because of climate change, and suddenly a degree of intensification in the catchments that feed those towns and lakes, then you're likely to have ecological issues, which is where the regional council comes in, because we get it in the neck every time something goes wrong anywhere in New Zealand to do with water quality. So there's no question there have been some unintended consequences. Some leaseholders have done very well out of tenure review. I suspect most of the ones that haven't gone through tenure review now were reluctant to do so because they couldn't see the benefit to them in going through tenure review. So the stopping of the tenure review is perhaps not such a big issue. It's this question now of the bureaucracy that's going to be put on top of those run holders, and they'll need some clarity as to who will have jurisdiction, whether it's Linds or the regional council, and they'll want that sorted out. And certainly the consenting process looks pretty onerous to me from a farmer's perspective. But they are farming in fairly sensitive catchments, a lot of these guys, and it's perhaps become really evident since COVID hit that an awful lot of New Zealanders have got nothing else to do other than drive around visiting more remote spots, which is pretty cool. But of course that has an impact. It not only has an impact on the ability of leaseholders to acquire enjoyment of their lease arrangements, which is one of their prerequisites, but it also puts other ecological pressures on the high country for which farmers can get blamed. And so I look at what's happened on Lake Clearwater and the Ashburton Lakes. You have thousands of people, the public up there enjoying the water skiing and bicycling and tramping and stuff on a weekend up by Lake Clearwater. And yet when something goes wrong with the lake, it's automatically the run holder who's blamed for that. And I think those issues will become more prevalent because the public are constantly being told that they are incredibly benign to the environment, whereas farmers are really, really bad, and that's clearly not always the case, and it's, well, many times it's not the case, but it's this conflict that we have, which the politicians, I think, quite often abuse. And I look at this act and wonder why, in fact, if Helen Clark hadn't intervened, however many years ago it was in the first place, whether you'd need to do this, whether in fact the state of the stewardship of the High Country was benign enough that actually you didn't need government intervention.
But it's certainly...
It's a long-winded way of not answering your questions.
No, you certainly have covered off absolutely everything I wanted you to there. Thank you very much, Ian. And it's like we've had a couple of Prime Ministers who want legacy projects, John Key with his cycleways and Helen Clark with her conservation estates for people to go tramping, and that was at all costs to get to that point, and we've seen the flow-on effects of that. What we are also seeing the flow-on effects of as well is pest management, and in all of my 35 years, and I'm sure there's people watching, the rabbit control is absolutely at its worst it's been in generations, just particularly in the Cromwell Basin, let alone other pests across, and the personal money these leaseholders put into annual pest control is never acknowledged at such a large scale, but it has a flow-on effect down into neighbouring properties that aren't under lease as well.
Yeah, look, I think you've touched on a really strong point there, Sarah, and that is that we keep getting told around our council table that we're in a biodiversity crisis. Well, depending on where you live, it's not entirely obvious, but, you know, I'm still young enough to be educated by people who think they know better than me. But the reality is that if we do have a biodiversity crisis in New Zealand, it's not because we've lost habitat, but it's because of invasive weeds and invasive pests and predators. And if you take away the jurisdiction from families who have intergenerational interest in their properties and give it to a Crown entity, history across New Zealand shows that is not a great way of looking after the interests of the land. And, you know, some of these issues they've had with fires and rabbits, as you say, but certainly invasive weeds, willows, gorse, broom, briar. New Zealand isn't the country it was 200 years ago when Pākehā first came here to settle. We brought a whole lot of problems with us in terms of these pests and weeds, and so shutting up stuff for conservation estate doesn't necessarily restore the ecological values that the desktop warriors who see themselves as the leading environmentalists in New Zealand actually want to achieve. And a prime case is the spread of wilding pines. You know, you shut up the High Country, take away anybody's interests and specific landowners' interests in managing that, and weeds will just proliferate. And so I think there's a lot of naivety driven by sort of political rhetoric in terms of the way we address environmental issues in New Zealand. And I think the High Country is probably a bit of a test case. A very small number of land people with an interest in the land, leaseholders or landowners, and a large number of public who all have opinions.
Yeah. I'd like to lastly ask you for our ignorance on the process, Ian. How close do central government work with regional councils to work on integrated solutions at a regional level?
The simple answer is I've only been a regional council for 18 months. I'm not sure how obvious it is.
There's been a lot happen in the last 18 months.
Yeah. Certainly we were, as a regional council, we were ignored by the government in terms of the essential freshwater package. I think a lot of it depends on the people involved and whether they've got personal connections to people in the right places. I'm not convinced that central government necessarily respects regional councils that much. It's not obvious in the way they operate. Having said that, we lost one of our top directors from the regional council, who is now sitting very close to God in at the Ministry for the Environment. And I think having those connections She's a very smart woman. Will make huge, might make huge differences as long as ministers don't get too involved in directing what can and can't happen. You know, a lot of this it depends on, a lot of this legislation, as we talked about Helen Clark and the unintended consequences of her interference in the High Country. A lot of it depends on whether the ministers who are driving these changes are doing it from a personal, because they've got an itch they're going to scratch, or whether it's actually genuinely a problem that needs to be solved. And I know that one of the submissions suggests that this whole Act reform is solving a problem that hasn't arisen yet. And I sometimes wonder about quite a lot of stuff that comes out of central government, where it's the minister who thinks they want to, as you say, they want to have a legacy project. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but I think that was the case for Eugenie Sage, who started this process. So she's not driving it anymore, clearly, but she's involved. If it's their legacy project, then the chances are the officials are trying to put in place something which isn't their own creation. So it's not driven by science, fact, or a logical conclusion. And that's really dangerous.
What a place to leave it there. Thank you so much, Ian Mackenzie, Environment Canterbury councillor, as well as local farmer who's been in local body politics across the board for quite some time, giving us some fantastic insight there from his perspective. To close the show, we have on the panel two fantastic high country women from two different areas, Kate Cox from Mount Nicholas Station in Queenstown and Emily Murray from Glenmore Station in the Mackenzie Basin, sharing their personal experience living and breathing this every day and how they want to see this go forward into the future, where we can nurture our communities as well as the environment and cohabit together.
Oh, nice boots.
Yeah, thanks. They're new.
Ben, you alright?
Oh, yeah, sorry, mate. Just meerkatting pretty hard, eh? Yeah. I just said to myself, Ben, work hard. You deserve new boots.